Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this legal compliance session run by Kaizen Synergy Law Firm. My name is Nihal Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy Law Firm, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. Today's session focuses on the overview of the new psychosocial laws and what these actually mean for charities. As always, we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar and recorded, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So today's session focuses specifically on what I'll call the new psychosocial laws for charities. And this has caused a significant degree of both confusion and anxiety for agencies. And so what we have done for you this afternoon is to give you a summary of what these legal requirements are. What do you as employers actually need to do, as well as what you are expected to do? Now, there are some rolling changes that are occurring across the country. Some of these have also required agencies to report on a number of psychosocial issues to relevant state departments, which we will cover off. Some areas do not need to do this. There's codes of conducts, which we'll cover off. And there's an expectation also when you look at some of the government regulatory sites for agencies to actually assemble compliance implementation teams. There's talk of becoming familiar with work health and safety guidelines and to put structures in place to review policies and procedures. But what the legislation doesn't actually do is to tell you, well, what does this actually look like? Obviously, if there are expectations from government agencies that you do this, then you would expect that maybe they would actually provide you with some guidance on, well, what do these look like? And really, I'm going to say this is a bit sparse in that space as well. So we're going to cover this off. What we're going to look at today is the specific legal requirements, recommendations. Here they are of what we're putting up. This webinar, as I mentioned, is being recorded, and you will all get access to these resources that I will show you as well. Next week, what we're going to do, and this is really from recommendations from a number of other charities as well, is that we're going to actually look at what I'll call the workflow of documentation. So things like, or workflow of the legal resources that we're going to give you some of these today. So that'll include checklists, that'll include incident reports, that'll include risk registers, that'll include codes of conduct and policy templates, all of which you can actually use within your agency and start to move this process forward. So at least you'll have, I'm going to say, a bit of a line in the sand of what to actually do. Now, if you do have any questions, by all means, you can reach out to us directly. You've got my mobile number here, as well as our general number and also our support desk email address as well too. Now, the legal resources that I'm going to mention, we are going to put a memo, legal update memo on everyone's notice board. I'll walk you through those. This webinar is also resources that we'll actually use, this one plus next week's one as well too. And these were particularly useful for agencies over the last few years with COVID, and we are continuing this webinar series. There's also training on these topics for board members, all staff, and volunteers as well too. And we've got template legal documents for OH&S policies, codes of conduct, incident reporting, and also risk registers. Now, I will just pause it here and just say, look, all of these legal resources that I am referring to, if you go to our website and access Gemba 360, and you can log in here, or you can simply go to the Gemba 360 directly as well too, and you will find that we've got the big blue circle that appears here. And to jump you into the resources, once you do jump in, a number of the resources that you'll find, obviously, on the notice board where we'll post the legal updates. There is also the Gemba docs for the policies, which we'll walk you through, and I'll show you what the codes of conduct that we're actually going to pull from. We've also got the incident reporting form, and again, I'm showing you all of these resources because these will come into effect, and I'll walk you through these during the presentation. But again, all of you have access to this as a resource. So we have, for some agencies, already started to update the incident report form. So looking at what are the 5 areas of psychosocial risks and when you need to report on those, and you can see those here, as well as under legislation now they are talking about do you have structures in place to review policies and procedures and link it to your incident reporting form as well too. So that is something we'll cover off in today's session along with the templates. You've also got access to what we call the risk register. Here it is here for things like your assessment registers that you do need to look at as part of your psychosocial risk assessments that you're doing as well. We also have pulled relevant policy templates from some of the regulatory agencies, which we will also be walking you through as well. There are parts of this that we've actually added to, and I will draw your attention to those, as well as also codes of conduct document. Again, in terms of, and we will actually look at this in some detail next week when we actually work through identifying psychosocial risks, assessing the risk, what does that look like, and then also what is the strategy for controlling that risk, obviously through things like incident reporting, board reporting, and also ensuring that you have a really appropriate control measures in place, because it's all well and good to read in legislation that you must take what is reasonable approach. But again, assessing what is reasonable can be quite subjective depending on what you need to actually do. So those are the resources that you do have access to. We will send you out an email this afternoon with these resources and access to all of those that I've just shown you, along with the copy of this webinar as well too, for you to be able to use the slides, and also if you wanted to rewatch this webinar as well. So really, what are the changes that everyone is talking about here? Well, essentially, there is now the requirement to identify psychosocial hazards. There are, in some cases, the proposed regulations which require employers, which is yourselves, so far as reasonably practical, to identify psychosocial hazards. Now, what does this actually mean? Well, essentially, psychosocial hazards are any factor or factors in your workplace, call it work design, systems of work, management of work, carrying out work of work, or personal or work-related interactions that may arise in the working environment and may cause an employee to experience one or more negative psychological responses that create a risk to their health and safety. Now, as you can imagine, that definition is very, very broad. So examples of this, when you go into Safe Work Australia, examples of this does include bullying, sexual harassment, aggression or violence, exposure to traumatic events or content, high job demands, low job demands as well too, low job control, poor support, poor organizational justice, low role clarity, poor environmental conditions, remote or isolated work, poor organizational change management, low recognition and reward, or poor workplace relationships. So you can see this definition is, by all accounts, incredibly broad. Now, this is something that Safe Work Australia has actually put out as well. So this is not just our interpretation of it. Where our interpretation will come into it is how on earth do you put this into a policy? And for yourselves, let's be quite open here. How are you expected to manage this? And also, what is the reasonableness in terms of what your agency needs to do? So, in terms of control risks to health and safety and the psychological hazards, well, essentially the regulations require employers, so far as reasonably practicable, to eliminate any risk associated with a psychological hazard. Where it is not reasonably practical to eliminate such a risk, the employer must reduce the risk in this order. Now, essentially, this means altering the management of work, whether that be the plant, the systems of work or work designs in the workplace environment, and then look at using information, instruction, or training, or a combination of one or two. Now, the regulations provide that an employer can only exclusively use the control measures in two if none of the measures in one are reasonably practicable. So you can see that when you look at this, there is a significant part of this legal compliance obligations that will come back down to your business process workflows. And that's why we're going to have a specific session next week to go through exactly what I'm talking about here. It's all well and good to have some of these processes in place, which many of you may, but essentially under the new regs, they're not just talking about, well, can you control it? Do you minimize it? Well, you actually need to look at, well, hang on, what is the step-by-step process that we're actually going to do this? Now, on top, I'll say not even on top of that, alongside that, if an employer, which is yourselves, identifies one or more of the following psychological hazards, an employer must implement a written prevention plan that identifies the risk, identifies measures to control the risk, and includes an implementation plan for any identified measures. Now, on this, these 5 areas include aggression, violence, bullying, exposure to traumatic contents or events, high job demands, or sexual harassment. Now, looking at this in terms of the expectations, and this is what the government regulators have put out. If we look at some of the government departments as well too, they have similar processes in terms of the expectations that your agency is expected to follow. Now, obviously, if you don't meet these expectations, what does that then mean? Well, essentially, there are fines. There's essentially compliance notices that can also be handed out, because essentially this is all covered under the safe work regulations, being health and safety, and also work health and safety rules as well too, that your agency already has to follow. Now, in the prevention plans that we're actually looking at here, one of the areas is around identification. And I did just want to jump back onto your Gemba dashboard. So if I go into here, one of the incident areas, let's say there's an incident that comes up. Now, what we actually have from here, and many of you already have access to this, and let me just bring this up. Essentially, you have then, and I just click on the incident form. Here we are here. Let me just press, there we go. Thank you. And from here, I'm simply going to add an incident. Now, I'm not going to go through this incident form. I will go through this next week, but essentially it does record the person's name and the date and the time that it's been done. What I did want to show you here, though, is that essentially there is what we've inserted here now is, does this involve a psychological risk and a written prevention plan? So essentially, if they mark that it's one or more of these items out of the 5 that the regulations require you to actually do, then essentially from here, what you then can do is look at your structures to review policies or procedures and mark what plans you now have in place. So the requirement is, I'll say, minimize psycho, and let me just put this in, psychological risk. The outcome is that, right, we're going to update the policy document. I'm just going to show, I can then identify who I'm actually going to send this to, when the review date is, when it is actually due, and I'm going to mark because it is a fairly substantive thing. I want it done by the end of the month. Now, essentially from here, what you're able to do is to bump this in and record this. So on the incident area, what you're able to do is essentially run this out and meet your individual reporting requirements directly from here. And if I scroll up, you can see in this space I've got, does this involve a psychological risk and a prevention plan? And do you have systems in place to manage this? Now, essentially from here, this is exactly what the expectations are from the government regulators for you as employers. Now, on top of this, of what we are also seeing is that there are further obligations which you may also be required to meet. Now, essentially, additional reporting scheme for employers with more than 50 employees. And essentially in Victoria, what we are seeing is that there are 2 reporting periods that you need to meet. Now, first of this is the proposed is that 1st of Jan to 30th of June inclusive for each calendar year, and then from 1 July to 31st of December, again inclusive of each calendar year. Now, in this case, within 30 days after the end of each reporting period, it is proposed that employers with more than 50 employees submit a de-identified report to WorkSafe Victoria with information about each reportable psychological complaint the employer received during the reporting period. Now, the report must include information about the gender of the persons involved and a description of the workplace relationship between the persons involved as well too. So now you can actually see we're actually starting to get into quite some detailed information of what yourselves are actually expected to do. So this is why, so thank you. Felicia's just asked, are these changes Australia-wide or just for Victoria? So currently, Felicia, we're seeing them in Victoria at this stage. For agencies that are required to, that obviously work across the across Australia, like yourselves, Felicia, as well too. There are obviously different states that you work across. Consequently, with that, there will be different reporting obligations that you will need to meet as part of that. Now, I will add, Felicia, that the incident reporting form and there is capacity to allow for people, which we have done for other agencies, depending on where the incident is essentially being reported on, will drive where what reporting obligations you need to have in place as well too. So you can, I'm going to say for a better word, isolate those. It will get confusing for some agencies where they are working, for example, up and down the east coast of the country. So some of their staff, for example, their risk managers that may actually oversee these reports may essentially be based in another state, but they will need to be across some of their other reporting obligations and timelines for that as well too. So in terms of the legislative overview, essentially, and we've just taken one of these out, but we will be covering each of these off as well. Essentially, it is drafted and there are guidelines coming out of managing psychosocial hazards at work and the codes of practice that Safe Work Australia has produced. Now, essentially what we are seeing is that there is an overarching piece of legislation from the Commonwealth, but there are other ministerial orders and with regulators and policy directives. Essentially what we have done for yourselves is to actually take apart each of the relevant areas. Just a reminder though that in terms of while this might be sitting with WorkSafe or Safe Work and within different states and territories, there is also further obligations that you need to meet as part of your general legal compliance obligations. So what I mean by that is when often I ask the question, who is looking at you? So while this is certainly sitting under safe work, and there is obviously reporting obligations that you may need to meet depending on which state and territory you're in, as well as incident reporting and the likes, what we do find though is that there are essentially other governance, risk and compliance obligations that will affect your board members in terms of ensuring that policies are out and that you also have appropriate reports within your risk registers to actually show that you're compliant with your psychosocial risk obligations. And this even stems back to the standards, and I'll just cover this very, very briefly. For example, Standard 3, for example, under the ACNC guidelines, talks about compliance with Australian laws, and usually these sort of standards sit at, I'll say, the governance level. But of course, if you're not meeting your psychosocial laws in terms of having accurate risk registers, showing how you manage these incidents and the likes, then it can very quickly become potentially a governance issue for yourselves. So what is the governance obligations? Well, Australia's model work health and safety laws are made up of the Model Work Health and Safety Act, Model WHS regulations, and Model Codes of Practice, all published by Safe Work. As a result of these WHS laws, in June 2022, a person conducting a business or undertaking a PCBU is now required to do a number of key things. So far as reasonably practical, you must ensure that workers and other people in the workplace are not exposed to risks to their psychological health and safety, as well as to risks to their physical health and safety. And this also includes you are required to eliminate psychosocial risks in the workplace, or if that is not reasonably practicable, to actually minimize these as so far is reasonably practical to do so. Now, these changes are being implemented, and I think this is what Felicia was getting at before. Essentially, if we look at a number of key states, New South Wales, Western Australia, Victoria, and Queensland, New South Wales has actually implemented these changes as of the 1st of October with its code of practice. Western Australia has adapted the New South Wales code to develop its own code of practice. Victoria is currently the only state or territory that is not part of the harmonised work health and safety scheme and is in the process of amending its occupational health and safety regulations. And these proposed new regulations are expected to start this year as well. There are some policy directives that have already come out as well that are providing guidance of this as well, and we're actually covering that off today. Queensland has passed work health and safety psychosocial risks, and it's under the Amendment Regulation 2022 to incorporate these changes from the 1st of April 2023. Now, that said, when you look at what is expected for public sector duty holders to be doing to prepare, essentially we are finding some three common grounds across state and territory departments, and essentially I've summarized these in these three slides. So the first is to assemble a compliance and implementation team. The second is to become familiar with the existing WorkSafe guidance on the 5 psychological risks. And the third is to put structures in place to review policies and procedures. Now, essentially, when they talk of assembling a compliance team, it's actually been stated in some of the government departments, and we have cut this verbatim from relevant state areas, is that for most agencies, they've actually stated it will not be a task that can be carried out by OH&S and people and culture teams alone. Therefore, it is recommended that agencies should therefore embark now on identifying the leaders best placed in the agency to lead the process of identifying psychosocial risks and providing feedback on the efficacy and existing and proposed control measures. So you can see that there is some anticipation from government departments that this will actually be broad-ranging and affect agencies. They also talk about that employers will be required to develop prevention plans to address risks posed by workplace aggression, violence, bullying, and exposure to traumatic content, as well as high job demands, and sexual harassment. We have, as part of this, and you'll see that I've just made some badges on the right-hand side, just referencing you to some of the workplace tools that we're going to cover off next week. And some of these can actually be put into things like your risk registers, which will identify exactly what and essentially walk you through some of the areas that you need to look at. And also, they talk about putting structures in place to review policies and procedures, and also what you need to do in order when a incident actually occurs. And it's for this reason that when I mentioned right at the start, that we've actually put in and started to amend some of the incident reports for agencies. We haven't done it for all agencies as yet, but this gives you an idea of the tools that you already have in place, and it's just a matter of us going through and walking you through this. So this way, you can start to manage your incidents as they're actually occurring. Equally, what I will add as well too is that for those of you that also have the risk registers in place, essentially you can also, if I just go back to here, you can also update your risk register with each of these entries. And we're going to go through this. So essentially by doing this within your agency, you'll very quickly be able to manage a lot of the, I'll call it compliance works that need to go on. Now, in terms of the legal resources, it is something that we mentioned. One of the other tools that you do have access to is also the codes of conduct and also the model safety rules as well. Some of our policy documents will actually spell out, and we have taken, as I mentioned, the regulator documents from Safe Work as well, looking at, well, what is the actual psychological hazards at work? When do you need to consult with staff and other personnel? How do you identify the risks? What is the assessment of the risks? And essentially going through that, I'll call it business process workflow, but meeting the legal compliance obligations as well. And in doing this, Safe Work also do cover off things like the risk registers and what those look like. You can see it is a Word document that we have opened up here as well too. And you do all have access to this. So if you did want to change it and say, add in your agency name, you can certainly do that. That's what these tools are actually here for. Here you can see it here. I'm just actually adding it in. And if you wanted to, as I said, it is a Word document that essentially, which we will circulate out, and it allows you to make as many changes as you want across it. Importantly, what we did want to ensure that you be across is that the legal requirements of the psychosocial laws are being rolled out. That said, there is the obligations for your agencies to look at compliance and implementation teams. There is the requirements to become familiar with the existing WorkSafe guidance on the 5 psychological areas. There is also in some states like Victoria, the need to consider how you're going to report these risks as well too, and who's going to be doing that moving forwards, as well as things like putting structures in place to review policies and also engage staff as part of this process as well. As I mentioned, this session was the introductory to the legal compliance space in terms of what we are covering. Next week, we are going to look at specifically the workflow of the psychosocial legal resources, including also tabling documents at the board meetings and what you should be informing your boards about, including also looking at your risk registers as well too, and also reporting on things like your incident reports as well. Essentially from there, you'll be able to then look at your policy documents and also look at what documents to table to your subcommittees as well moving forwards. We will cover that off as part of the workflow and also notifying staff about the psychological risks and what's involved for your agency. More than happy to stay online and answer any questions that you might have after today's session. If you are watching this session after today's live presentation and do have any questions, then by all means, please reach out to us on 1300 360 360, or by all means, email us at support@gemba360.com. I will add, if you are jumping into the Gemba dashboard as well too, and do have any questions, we do encourage you to use the chat bar on the bottom left-hand corner. You will find that the support desk does follow you right through it. So whether you're outside the system or inside your general dashboard, or actually completing some of the resources, you'll be able to access it directly from here. I will add, just to finish off as well too, that all of these webinars are being recorded and will actually appear in your Gemba College space as well too. This is where you do find your child safe training as well, and we will be having this specific tab for you for the psychosocial laws as well. If you are watching this recording after today's live session and wanted to get some resources, by all means, please reach out to us. Otherwise, thank you for joining us today on the live session. We will stop the recording and open it up for any questions.